He died 3 times, under 3 different names, and no one can prove any of them were real. In the American West, names were supposed to anchor a man to something: a town, a family, a record, a grave. This one did none of that. Across several frontier newspapers, court summaries, and witness accounts, a pistolero appears again and again, always described as the same man, yet never under the same name twice. Each identity leads to nothing: no birth record, no confirmed arrest, no verified death. History insists these names belong to one person. The problem is that history cannot find him. The figure first enters a record during a period when violence in the West was no longer shocking, but it was still newsworthy. Towns were expanding. Law enforcement existed, but inconsistently. Newspapers filled the gaps between rumor and fact with urgency rather than verification. In this environment, names travel faster than people. The earliest references describe a gunman involved in a violent confrontation on the edge of a growing settlement. The article does not dwell on his background. It does not explain where he came from. It simply names him, describes his actions, and moves on. The name is presented confidently. Readers were expected to accept it. That name appears only once. Months later, a remarkably similar description surfaces in a different town. Another shooting, another confrontation, another gunman whose age, build, demeanor, and habits align almost perfectly with the earlier report. But the name is different. Again, no origin is provided. No prior history is cited. The article frames him as a known threat, yet offers no evidence that anyone had known him before that moment. The third name appears later still, attached to an incident hundreds of miles away. Once more, the description matches. Same physical traits, same behavior, same reputation for violence. The newspapers treat this as continuity. They assume the reader will too. At no point do they explain why the name has changed. This would not have been unusual. In the Old West, identity was flexible. Many men traveled under aliases. Some reinvented themselves deliberately. Others were renamed by reporters who misunderstood accents, misspelled surnames, or relied on secondhand information. Most of the time, these inconsistencies eventually corrected themselves. This one never did. Each name exists in isolation. None connect backward. None leave a trace forward. And yet, the man they describe feels continuous. That continuity is what made the story survive. The gunman's reputation grows not through confirmed biography, but through repetition. Each article reinforces the last. Each account assumes the existence of a man whose identity has never been established. Violence becomes his signature, but signatures require authors. In this case, no author can be found. The first name appears in a town with functioning courts, yet no indictment survives. No jail record exists. The second name is tied to a region with active law enforcement, yet no arrest warrant can be traced. The third name is associated with death, a killing reported confidently, but no burial record, death certificate, or grave aligns with it. 3 names, 3 endpoints, 0 confirmation. At the time, this did not raise alarms. Frontier record-keeping was inconsistent. People disappeared. Men died without paperwork. Graves went unmarked. This was accepted reality. But what makes this case different is not that records are missing. It is that every record is missing. Each identity fails independently. That suggests something more than poor documentation. It suggests instability at the core of the story. The newspapers that carried these accounts were not obscure. They were regional publications with access to local officials, sheriffs, and court clerks. Their reports often included names precisely because names mattered. Naming a gunman gave violence shape. It made it manageable. It implied accountability, even when none followed. And yet, no authority ever seems to have confirmed who this man actually was. No follow-up article announces his capture. No court transcript confirms his trial. No obituary resolves his fate. Instead, the story simply moves. From town to town, from name to name, from incident to incident, Each time, the description remained stable, which raises an uncomfortable question. If the descriptions were accurate, but the names were not, then what exactly was being tracked? A man or a pattern? At this stage in the story, history offers reassurance. It tells us this was one individual using aliases, a drifter, an outlaw skilled at avoiding records, a man who understood how to stay just ahead of documentation. That explanation is plausible. It is also convenient because it allows a narrative to remain intact without requiring proof. The man existed, the names changed, the violence was real. Case closed, except the explanation breaks down when examined closely. And that examination begins with the first identity, the name that introduced a man to history. That name should lead somewhere. It doesn't. The first name appears suddenly and disappears just as fast. In the earliest surviving reports, the gunman is introduced as a known figure. The article does not explain why he is known, only that he is. His age is estimated. His appearance is described in confident terms. His behavior is framed as familiar to those who live in the area. Yet nothing precedes him. There is no earlier mention, no record of arrival, no note of where he came from or how long he had been there. He enters a narrative fully formed, already dangerous, already armed, already understood to be a problem. This is not how most outlaws appear in the historical record. Even men who lived under aliases tended to leave traces. Arrests, minor charges, employment records, disputes. Something usually anchored them to place. This name does not anchor to anything. The incident tied to him is violent but contained. A confrontation, shots fired, a man wounded or killed, depending on which account is read. Authorities are said to have responded. Statements were taken, and then the trail ends. There is no arrest record tied to the name, no warrant preserved, no court proceeding. The gunman is neither captured nor confirmed dead. He simply exits the narrative. If this were the only instance, it would be unremarkable. It isn't. Months later, a second name surfaces. The circumstances are different, but the description is not. The man is again portrayed as dangerous, quick to violence, and familiar to the town. Witnesses describe his movements, his posture, his way of handling a revolver. The language is strikingly similar. Yet this time, the name does not match. The article offers no explanation for this. It does not suggest an alias. It does not acknowledge the earlier incident. It treats this man as new, even as it describes him as known. Once again, there is no backstory. The second identity appears, commits violence, and vanishes. Attempts to trace this name encounter the same problem. No birth record, no census listing, no tax document, no land ownership, no confirmed employment, no family connection. Even in regions where documentation was inconsistent, some trace usually survives. Here there is none. The second name ends in ambiguity. Reports disagree on whether the gunman escaped, was wounded, or was killed. One article claims he fell during the exchange. Another suggests he fled town before authorities arrived. No burial record aligns with either version. The third name appears later still, and this is where the story becomes most unsettling. This time, the gunman is described as having a reputation that extends beyond the town where the incident occurred. He is portrayed as someone whose name carries weight, someone whose presence alone creates tension. And yet, this is the first time the name appears in print. Again, there is no introduction. The incident attached to this name is decisive. A gunfight, a body. The article states plainly that the gunman was killed. It reads like closure, except the details do not hold. The location of the death varies between reports. The circumstances shift. Some say he was shot while resisting arrest. Others claim he was killed in a private dispute. The description of the body does not align across accounts. Most importantly, no physical trace remains. There is no grave that can be tied to the name, no coroner's record, no confirmation from local authorities that the death occurred as described. The man is declared dead and then erased. 3 identities, each treated as real, each treated as final, each collapsing under scrutiny. At this point, the accepted explanation steps in again. Aliases. The Old West was full of them. Men change names to escape warrants, reinvent themselves, or simply start over. Newspapers were notorious for misspellings and misunderstandings. Under this explanation, the story becomes coherent. 1 man, 3 names, 1 violent career. It is a reassuring interpretation, but it relies on an assumption that does not survive examination, that the man himself was consistent. If these were aliases used by the same individual, then certain traits should persist beyond description. Patterns of movement, associations, preferred regions, familiar contacts. They don't. Each name appears in a different area, with no overlapping acquaintances, no shared witnesses, no recurrent locations, no trail of movement connecting one identity to the next. There is no narrative of travel. The man does not arrive. He materializes. This is not how fugitives behave. Men on the run tend to stay near known networks. They rely on familiarity. They leave trails of contact, however faint. This figure leaves none. And yet, the descriptions remain consistent. This contradiction is the heart of the mystery. The man seems stable on the page, but unstable in reality. That suggests something else is being stabilized. Not the person. The story. Frontier newspapers operated under pressure. They needed to explain violence quickly. They relied on local sources, rumors, and official statements that were often incomplete or self-serving. Naming a gunman simplified chaos. It turned an incident into a narrative. But when names failed to hold, the narrative did not collapse. It adapted. A new name was supplied. The description remained. The reader filled in the gap. This process repeated until the figure took on a life independent of any single identity. By the time the 3rd name appears, the gunman no longer needs a biography. He is already understood, which raises a possibility that the historical record never explores, that the continuity exists only on paper, that the man described under 3 names may not have been 1 man at all. At this stage, history resists that conclusion. It insists that variability is normal, that the frontier was chaotic, that documentation was poor. All true, but those explanations do not account for the pattern. Poor records create randomness. This record creates consistency without foundation. Each identity is treated as real. Each identity fails independently, yet the composite figure survives intact. This is not accidental. It suggests that the record was never tracking a person. It was tracking a role that could be filled by a different man at different times, a role that newspapers, authorities, and communities needed to exist. But that realization does not fully surface yet. For now, the story remains comfortable. 1 man, 3 names, a violent life, an unclear end. History moves forward without resolving which name was real or whether any of them were. The ambiguity is accepted because ambiguity is easier than reconstruction. And that is where the second part of the context ends, with 3 identities that do not connect, and a figure that somehow persists anyway. By the time the 3rd name enters the record, the story has already stabilized, not because the facts are clear, but because repetition has done its work. The gunman is no longer introduced as a stranger. He is treated as a known quantity. Newspapers assume familiarity. Authorities speak of him as if his identity were settled, even when the name itself has changed again. At this stage, the narrative no longer depends on verification. It depends on recognition. Readers are not being asked to meet a man. They are being asked to recognize a figure. That figure carries expectations, violence, reputation, predictability. When his name appears, the outcome feels inevitable. And this is where the historical record quietly shifts its priorities. Early frontier reporting often struggled with uncertainty. Details were debated, account conflicted. Editors sometimes acknowledged gaps. But once a narrative became useful, uncertainty stopped being emphasized. In the case of this gunman, uncertainty becomes background noise. The third identity is described with confidence that has not been earned. His supposed history is referenced without citation. His reputation is treated as established fact, despite the absence of any documented foundation. And yet, no one at the time seems troubled by this, because the story now serves a function. Frontier violence demanded explanation. Towns needed to believe that danger had a face. Lawmen needed someone to pursue. Newspapers needed continuity. A man with a name, any name, provided that. The fact that the name kept changing did not weaken the narrative. It strengthened it. Each new identity allowed the story to reset without being challenged. If one name failed to hold, another replaced it. The figure remained intact. This process was not coordinated. It did not require conspiracy. It required only momentum. Once the idea of a single gunman existed, evidence was interpreted to support it. Descriptions were aligned. Incidents were grouped. Contradictions were smoothed over. This is how legends form, not through invention, but through consolidation. The historical record gives us enough clues to see this happening in real time. Descriptions of the gunman's behavior grow more stylized. Language repeats. Phrases recur across different newspapers in different towns. The man is described less as an individual and more as a type. Quick-tempered, deadly, unpredictable. These traits become shorthand. They eliminate the need for deeper explanation. And once shorthand takes hold, scrutiny fades. At this point, history offers its strongest defense. It tells us that aliases were common. That mobility explains the lack of documentation. That the absence of records is not evidence of absence. All of this is true, but it does not answer the central problem. If this was one man using 3 names, then at least one of those names should connect to something real. A childhood, a family, an origin, a trail that existed before the violence. None does. Each identity begins at the moment of conflict and ends immediately afterward. That is not how people exist. It is how events exist, which leads to a troubling possibility the record never confronts, that the gunman is not the subject of the story. The violence is. The names are not identifiers. They are labels attached to incidents that needed to be explained quickly. In this reading, each name does not represent a man who moved across towns. Each name represents a decision to simplify. A shooting occurs. Witnesses are confused. Authorities need clarity. A name is supplied. Later, a similar shooting occurs elsewhere. The details resemble the previous incident. The story requires continuity. Another name is supplied, but the description remains. The reader connects the dots. The record appears coherent. But coherence is not proof. It is design. This interpretation remains unspoken in traditional histories because it destabilizes too much. If the gunman was not one person, then the deaths attributed to him may involve multiple actors. Responsibility becomes diffuse. Law enforcement narratives unravel. The idea that violence could be contained by eliminating a single individual collapses. That is not a comfortable conclusion, so the record resists it. Instead, it treats the ambiguity as unfortunate but harmless. The lack of documentation becomes an accepted quirk of the era. The changing names are dismissed as clerical error or intentional deception. The core assumption remains intact. There was a man, and he was dangerous, and he existed. Yet even as history insists on this, it fails to answer a basic question. Which name was real? If the third identity truly represents the end of the man's life, then the earlier 2 deaths were false. If the second identity marked his death, then the third appearance is impossible. If none of the deaths can be confirmed, then the entire timeline dissolves. The record does not choose. It avoids choosing, because choosing would require admitting uncertainty at the center of the narrative. Instead, the ambiguity is allowed to linger as texture rather than evidence. This is where the story reaches its breaking point, not because something new appears, but because nothing does. No document ever surfaces that ties the three identities together conclusively. No authority steps forward to reconcile them. No historian can point to a moment when a man's life begins or ends. He exists only in flashes, moments of violence, moments of attribution, moments of disappearance. Between those moments, there is nothing. That nothingness is where the accepted narrative quietly asks for trust. Trust that the gaps are incidental. Trust that the aliases explain everything. Trust that the absence of proof does not matter. But trust is not evidence. And the longer one looks at the pattern, the harder it becomes to accept that this was simply one man slipping through the cracks. The cracks are too consistent, the timing too convenient, the erasures too complete. By the end of the third identity, the story is no longer about who this man was. It is about why the record needs him to have existed. Because without him, the violence becomes harder to explain. It becomes systemic rather than personal. It implicates more people. It demands broader accountability. A single outlaw absorbs blame efficiently. Multiple unknown gunmen do not. And this is where the context ends. Not with an answer, but with a pressure point. Because the next step is unavoidable. Either the record is incomplete in ways that cannot be repaired, or it is incomplete in ways that were chosen. And once that question is asked, the story can no longer remain comfortable. The next phase is not about context. It is about dismantling what that context has been protecting. Before we go any further, a quick reminder. If you value investigations that slow down instead of simplifying, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps keep stories like this examined, rather than accepted. Now, let's dismantle what we've been given. The idea that this was one man using multiple names is not a conclusion. It is a convenience. It survives not because it is proven, but because it prevents the need for deeper reconstruction. Once that assumption is accepted, every inconsistency becomes explainable. Missing records become expected. Contradictions become personality quirks. Conflicting deaths become clerical errors. The story stops being fragile. But when the assumption is tested directly, it collapses. The first fracture appears when we examine how aliases actually functioned in the Old West. Men did change names. That part is true. But aliases were not random. They were chosen, reused, and often connected to something real. A previous town, a former employer, a known associate. Even fugitives left patterns. Here, there are none. Each of the three names appears only at the moment of violence and disappears immediately afterward. No overlap, no reuse, no gradual transition from one identity to the next. This is not how aliases work. This is how labels work. The second fracture is geographic. If one man carried out all three incidents, then his movement should be traceable in time. Not precisely, but plausibly. Distances should align. Travel windows should exist. Routes should make sense. They don't. In at least one instance, the timing between incidents would require movement that exceeds what was realistically possible given terrain, weather, and transportation of the period, especially for a man avoiding attention. The accepted explanation dismisses this as approximation, but approximation cannot erase physical limits. The third fracture is social. Violence in frontier towns rarely occurred in isolation. Men knew each other. They drank together. They worked together. They argued before they shot. Yet across all three identities, no consistent social connection appears. No shared associate is named. No recurring witness reappears. No overlapping reputation precedes a violence. Each incident introduces a fully formed villain with no social footprint. That is not a man moving through communities. That is a role being dropped into them. The fourth fracture is legal. In two of the three cases, authorities are described as responding. Sheriffs are mentioned. Deputies are named. Statements are said to have been taken. And yet, no legal process survives. No warrant. No indictment. No court appearance. Not even a dismissal. This absence is explained away as poor record keeping. But poor record keeping does not selectively erase every step between accusation and resolution, while preserving vivid descriptions of violence. The fifth fracture is death. At least 2 of the names are reported as having died, in one case, definitively, in another, likely, and yet neither death anchors to a body that can be confirmed. No grave, no coroner's report, no burial record. In an era where death was common and documentation imperfect, this still stands out. Deaths tend to leave something behind. Here, death leaves nothing. The sixth fracture is narrative behavior. Notice how the newspapers handle uncertainty. Early articles hedge carefully. Language is conditional. Details are attributed to sources. But as a figure accumulates reputation, certainty increases, even as evidence decreases. Descriptions grow more confident. Conclusions become firmer. The man's character solidifies. This is the opposite of how evidence-driven reporting behaves. It is exactly how myth behaves. The seventh fracture is repetition. Phrases recur across different towns and publications. Not just ideas, wording, structure, tone. This suggests that later reports were not observing independently. They were inheriting a template. Once the idea of a single dangerous gunman existed, it became easier to frame new violence within that idea than to explain it fresh. This is how complexity disappears. The eighth fracture is probability. For the accepted explanation to be true, several unlikely things must all be true at once. One man must have committed all the violence. He must have changed names perfectly, leaving no trace. He must have traveled implausible distances without detection. He must have left no social footprint. He must have died multiple times without documentation. Each of these is possible individually. Together, they are not. When explanations require stacking improbabilities, they stop being explanations. They become beliefs. And that brings us to the critical question the accepted version never asks. What if the continuity exists only because the record needs it to? What if the 3 names do not point to one man moving across the West, but to 3 different incidents being folded into a single narrative because doing so made the violence manageable? This does not require conspiracy. It requires habit. When violence repeats, institutions search for patterns. When patterns appear, names are assigned. When names exist, responsibility feels contained. Multiple unknown gunmen create chaos. One known gunman creates order. The record shows order. At this stage, the story is no longer about whether the man existed. It is about whether the record could afford for him not to. And that realization is where the dismantling truly begins. Because once the figure is removed, the violence does not disappear. It multiplies. And the next part of the investigation asks the question history avoided. If this was not one man with 3 names, then how many men were there? And why did the record need them to become one? Once the idea of a single gunman is removed, something unsettling takes its place. Not chaos, exposure. Because without one man holding the story together, the violence no longer belongs to an individual. It spreads outward into towns, institutions, incentives, and habits that the historical record rarely examines directly. This is where the explanation stops being about identity and starts being about function. Frontier communities needed violence to make sense. Shootings disrupted commerce. They scared settlers. They threatened the image of order that towns depended on to grow. Explaining violence quickly mattered more than explaining it accurately. A known gunman solved several problems at once. He gave fear a face. He turned randomness into narrative. He implied that removing one man would restore order. And most importantly, he kept responsibility contained. If violence could be attributed to a single roaming figure, then no town had to examine itself. No lawman had to explain why conflict escalated. No social tension had to be addressed. The problem came from outside, passed through, left behind damage. This is why the record behaves the way it does. When shootings occurred, witnesses disagreed, accounts conflicted, timelines didn't align. In that uncertainty, a name became an anchor. Even if the anchor was imaginary, borrowed, or recycled, The newspapers did not invent violence. They organized it. An organization requires simplification. This is where the three names stop being identities and start being placeholders. Each name appears exactly where clarity is needed most. Immediately after blood is spilled. Each disappears once the incident is no longer urgent. None exist before. None persist after. That is not coincidence. It suggests that the names were not tracking a man's life. They were tracking moments that demanded explanation. Once the moment passed, the name was no longer useful, so it was discarded. This also explains why the descriptions remain consistent, while the identities do not. The descriptions are not forensic. They are symbolic. They describe what the community fears. A volatile outsider, quick to violence, resistant to authority. These traits are broad enough to apply repeatedly, yet specific enough to feel real. They do not identify a person. They justify a story. And once a story works, it gets reused. The record never pauses to ask whether multiple men might be responsible, because that question creates more problems than it solves. Multiple gunmen means multiple failures. It means law enforcement failed repeatedly, not once. It means social tensions were unresolved, not incidental. It means violence was systemic, not exceptional. A single outlaw absorbs all of that, which is why the record keeps him alive. Even after killing him, this is the part that should unsettle you most. At least two of the three names are reported as dead, and yet the figure survives. Not because evidence demands it, but because the narrative does. The death of the gunman does not end the violence. So the record quietly allows him to reappear under a new name. The description stays. The fear stays. The solution stays theoretical. Kill the outlaw. Restore order. Except order never truly returns. And the record never confronts that. Instead, it repeats the cycle. New incident. New name. Same man. This is not historical confusion. It is historical maintenance. By the time later historians inherit the record, the consolidation is complete. They see three names connected by description and behavior. They assume continuity. They explain the gaps with aliases and poor documentation. They are not wrong to do so. They are doing what the record trained them to do. But training is not truth. And when the explanation is finally pushed to its limit, something becomes unavoidable. The story requires you to believe that one man was everywhere violence needed to be explained, that he arrived without history, that he left without consequence, that he died without trace, and that he returned when necessary. That is not a man. That is a narrative device, which leaves us with a harder, quieter conclusion. There may never have been one gunman. There may have been several. Men whose names were never preserved. Men who were blamed, killed, or forgotten. Men who existed only long enough to serve the moment they were needed. The record did not care which was which. It cared that the violence had an explanation. And once that explanation was accepted, the rest became optional. So the question is no longer, who was a man known by three names? The question is, how many men were erased to make him exist? And that is where the story stops offering answers. Because answers would require reopening cases that were never meant to stay open. It would require admitting that the record did not fail accidentally. It did exactly what it was supposed to do. It simplified. It stabilized. It moved on. The gunman with three names remains because he is useful, not because he is real. And the men who may have stood behind him remain unnamed because they are not. That silence is not empty. It is full of decisions that were never revisited. Full of violence that was never isolated, full of a history that chose coherence over accuracy. And once that choice is made, it rarely gets undone. If this investigation changed the way you see these stories, consider leaving a like and subscribing. It helps keep the record open instead of quietly sealed.